Mauricio Fontana is Phosphate Analyst at CRU, examining global production and demand markets. He's the editor of CRU's Phosphate Rock Market Outlook, which I subscribe to. His other research interests include sustainability in phosphate markets and developments in agricultural production in Latin America. And he hails from sunny Rio de Janeiro, but currently is based in rainy London.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who aren't familiar with CRU and the work that we do, we're a research firm based in London. Amongst other commodities, a lot of what we work with is in phosphate fertilizer markets, sort of looking at very global trends of where phosphate is being produced, where it's being sold to, what trade links are present, and how they're changing. I think it's good to remember that a lot of phosphate fertilizers are traded internationally, and so a global perspective is always important in phosphate. And so, as many of you know, in these markets, it's been a very, very tumultuous 2022 with a number of different factors that completely changed up the markets, both in raw materials and in downstream phosphate fertilizers. And so I kind of wanted to give an overview of CRU's view on 2022 and the kind of impact that the events this year have had, and link these to some of the lessons we can take away from that about sustainability in phosphate. So the three big stories that we saw in 2022 were the invasion of Ukraine, China's export restrictions, and the high prices that these two things caused. So beginning with Ukraine, following the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and on Russian companies, a lot of the trade between Russia and Europe was largely suspended, and European buyers have had to find new sources. And seeing the high prices that were coming up in late 2021, China instated export restrictions on phosphate fertilizers. They were, for a very long time, the biggest exporters of phosphate fertilizers, supplying a lot of the world market, particularly in India and Brazil. And looking to preserve their own food security, they kind of cut that in October 21. And so these two conditions, as you can see here in this graph, we can see a big cut in how much of the world supply that China was providing. So these two market conditions were, we already had high prices in late 2021, and this combined with these two events caused prices to absolutely spike, as you can see in the graph, to not quite record levels, but close to it in this year. So looking a little bit closer at each of these developments, in Russia, we've seen a lot of their shift away from Europe, causing Europe to have a lot of demand destruction this year. However, Russia managed to very quickly find new places to export to. In particular, they increased their trade India, which is the biggest fertilizer market in the world. This was despite a lot of speculation about where Russian fertilizers would go following the invasion of Ukraine. A lot of purchasers in Brazil and India weren't sure whether they were going to be able to export at all. And looking at China, which is one of the most important markets, both as a producer, as an exporter, and its own domestic market in phosphates, China, despite holding only a small portion of the global reserves, they are the biggest producer and consumer of phosphate. Food security is a really big concern for the central government in China. And so I think this is an old version of the slideshow, unfortunately. I meant to say in late 2021, the high fertilizer prices caused the government to impose very severe export restrictions. And eventually these culminated in specific quotas for each company in China as to how much they can export. These export restrictions caused downstream phosphate exports to be cut in about half. So as you can imagine, this has had a massive impact in phosphate markets because the biggest producer curtailing their exports in half is a big deal. And there's varying views about what happens for the future in China. Um, and although we don't have concrete announcements yet, it's expected that these restrictions are going to continue into 2023 and onwards. With that, we think it's quite likely that China has peaked as a phosphate exporter. Because China doesn't have so many phosphate resources and is a big producer and a big consumer, we think it's likely that they're going to focus the shift to shift their market away from exporting and focus to preserve their domestic resources within the country. Um, and so, if we consider the Fertilizer Association of China has published their 5-year plan, they say they look to cut capacity for fertilizers in China by 20% in the next or so years. And you can see in that top graph, it would be a very significant curtailing of production should they choose to do that and follow through with those plans. This plan would favor the bigger companies and see a greater consolidation of production in China's phosphate industry. And the key thing that I want to take away from this, that's particularly relevant when we try to understand phosphate sustainability, is that we really need to understand China very well. The strategic decisions of the Chinese government and what they choose to do with their phosphate resources are going to be very key in defining the international phosphate markets, both in the next few years and in the longer term. Looking elsewhere around the world, in Brazil, one of the bigger markets for fertilizer imports, a lot of people were quite concerned in the aftermath of the Russian invasion about the availability of phosphate. This caused quite high inventories where we are today, despite overall imports being a bit lower. Similarly, the United States has ended up with quite large inventories, despite some production troubles caused by Hurricane Ian. And finally, India, which is the most important import market, is expected to import a large amount of fertilizers, both this year and next year in the build-up to the elections. In India, farmers are a big voting bloc, and so making sure that they're happy is an important priority for the government. If we look at the picture globally, despite these key regions being fairly well stocked at the moment, we saw that because of these very high prices, demand for phosphates fell by about 8%. It's quite a large amount that could have an impact on yields. These high phosphate prices that we saw have been supported by high crop prices. These high crop prices, in turn, being caused by a variety of factors. You can see here in the bottom chart is our forecast for crop prices. These include just economies coming out of the pandemic lockdowns, rising inflation, speculative trading, and fallout from the invasion of Ukraine. This is likely to get worse following Russia pulling out of the grain deal a few days ago. And these crop prices have made phosphate fertilizer more affordable. Not quite at the same rate. Phosphate fertilizer got a lot more expensive, whereas crops only got some more expensive. But we expect that these crop prices are going to be quite high. And I think this is another important lesson here, is that when we talk about fertilizer sustainability, we're also talking about food sustainability. And in a world where a lot of food security is tied to international prices, when crop prices go up, it means that a lot of the effort and successes that we've had in tackling hunger and poverty get undone. So, what happens next? And do we think that markets are going to normalize in the next year? And the short answer is only a bit. We think that the most severe ramifications of the invasion of Ukraine and of strategic decisions will start to fade away, but we do think that there's going to be some kind of structural change in the phosphate markets. European buyers are likely to shy away from Russian fertilizers, even though fertilizers aren't directly covered under sanctions. And prices are expected to come down gently for the next year or two, but stay quite high and maybe at a new normal as China withdraws from that export market. Um, if we see here, we expect that that dip in global demand that we saw last year is going to, or sorry, global production that we saw last year is going to recover into 2023 and onwards, but it will be supplemented by new sources of phosphate rather than just China. And looking forward in the long term, in the long term view, is that we see a overwhelming trend that phosphate demand is going to increase. This seems like a very basic thing, but it's just undeniable reality that unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, I suppose, we will have to deal with. As more countries come into higher income brackets, meat consumption has risen and always will rise. Africa's demand for fertilizers is very likely to rise. OCP in Morocco has been trying to expand further into Africa as they see a growing population and a growing industrialization of agriculture, as well as a growing demand for meat, will all cause a greater phosphate demand. And finally, this is something we get asked about a lot, is the rise of lithium ferrophosphate batteries. These are still a minor demand driver. For those of you not familiar, these are a type of electric car and power grid batteries that are known to be a bit safer than traditional batteries, and so there has been having growing demand for them. This is still primarily in China, where in the next 5 to 10 years we expect that this will be a noticeable source of phosphate demand, but could also take off here in the United States, as some of the recent infrastructure policies have targeted to try and grow this market. And similarly, we're likely to see a shift in where production occurs in the world and in global phosphate markets. China is likely to be producing more slowly, to focus more on their domestic markets, to focus more on guaranteeing food security within the country. And so this means that countries that relied on the cheap fertilizer imports will have to find a new source for it. If you look at this graph here on the right, this is our long-term forecast for real fertilizer prices for the next until 2045. And as you can see, it's even in real terms, it's going to be a more and more significant part of agricultural inputs. Similarly, the U.S. is likely to increase their reliance on phosphate imports, as we were seeing kind of degrading quality of the rock here. And who will fill in those gaps? The two big answers is very likely OCP. Morocco holds the majority of global phosphate reserves, and so has been very rapidly expanding their capacity to produce fertilizer. And just for that simple fact, it's inevitable that Morocco will become by far the most important player in phosphates. Similarly, in Saudi Arabia, Ma'aden, the company, has been very rapidly expanding their industry and exporting fertilizers around the world, and will become another key player. And a last thing that I want to say on phosphate markets is that we're seeing an increasing integration of phosphate. And what I mean by that is that more and more the people and places that are mining phosphate rock are the same companies and countries that are processing that phosphate rock. OCP, for example, used to be primarily an exporter of phosphate rock to countries that would then process it into fertilizers, but these days have vastly increased the amount of phosphate rock that they process domestically. And so, what's the bigger picture in all of this? That was a lot of information on a very tumultuous 2022. I started working with Crew this year, and so they've really thrown me straight into the deep end. But there's a few key lessons that I want to say that I think we can draw from this year. Firstly, is that we're going to see phosphate trade markets necessarily change as the key producers around the world wind down some of their capacity. That's particularly China and the US. Furthermore, it's difficult to overstate the importance, even as they wind down, to overstate the importance of China as a global player. It can be very tempting to treat China as a bit of a black box when we consider global markets, but they are far, far too important for us to be able to do that. Making links with China's industry and with their scientific research will be really important to understanding and developing sustainability in phosphate, particularly as they've had recently some very bold and aggressive measures to tackle sustainability across chemical processing, including in phosphates, both which has lessons to learn of success and failure. The third point is that growing phosphate demand is unfortunately inevitable as populations grow and as that meat consumption grows. This isn't to disagree with Sylvia's wonderful talk about the importance of considering production of agriculture, but rather to understand that the big demand drivers for growing phosphate, particularly growing meat consumption in China and growing populations across the world, will always put an upwards pressure on phosphate, and it will be difficult to forge global solutions that don't acknowledge that a lot of countries that have missed out on the benefits of fertilizers don't wish to cut back on applications. Number four is that a model of agricultural production, like we have in a lot of countries today, that relies on cheap fertilizer imports is quite fragile. These markets have been proved to be prone to a lot of geopolitical difficulty and can break quite easily. And sustainability is just an environmental thing. It's also about making sure that people have secure access to food supplies. And for models that rely on those cheap fertilizer imports can be quite fragile for that. And finally, the trend towards greater integration of phosphate rock is going to make phosphate independence or phosphate sovereignty for individual countries quite a difficult task. Phosphate trade and markets and the kinds of things that we work with are going to be essential to supply a lot of countries with their phosphate needs, even if that's just a geographical restriction. Trade also needs to be sustainable, and solutions to sustainability need to be global and involve all partners to become less prone to that. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions.
When you say phosphorus production, are you also including recycled phosphorus? If so, where is most of this coming from?
So, recycled phosphorus doesn't make up a very significant portion of the overall industry. And there are a lot of initiatives to increase that portion, in particular in the EU. They look to implement more of a circular economy in recycling that phosphorus. So most of the projects for phosphorus recycling are in the EU, but at the moment they make up a very insignificant portion of overall production, unfortunately.
I recently heard about an investment of $7 billion in Algeria, a Chinese and Algerian joint venture company.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on that? Will that fly?
So that project in Algeria is a revived project that has popped up every few years as another big investment. And so far it hasn't taken off. It's something we keep an eye on. There's a lot in fertilizer. A lot of the times there's a lot of talk about these very big and ambitious projects that don't always take off the ground. And let me put it like this: we have it down as a speculative project in our capacity databases, just because there's not a lot of details going forward about it at the moment. A lot of these projects are just talk, but I've been wrong before.
Okay, thank you. Second question, the LFP batteries take apparently a larger market share than initially forecasted by now. How do you see that? We considered 5% of global phosphorus consumption. That may disappear in feed phosphates and may come up in LFP phosphates. How do you see that?
So LFP markets is the big discussion point in phosphates at the moment, and it's something we're working on putting together a very thorough view on. It's very, very quickly moving in that, in China, the capacity is going to increase tens and tens of times over in the next 5 or so years. Our preliminary figures is that in the next, it could make up around 5% of production by maybe 5% of production within China by maybe 2027, 2028. But these are very rough numbers because it's such a quickly moving industry that it's difficult to foresee where it's going to develop.
I had a question over at this end of the table. So when you showed those fertilizer prices over time, especially phosphorus, the last peak like this was back in 2008. And I thought back then the main driver was energy prices. Like natural gas was $13 per million BTU. Yet you don't mention anything about energy costs this go around. Why is that?
Energy cost was a pretty significant factor this go around. I guess the reason I haven't mentioned it is just because it seemed the Chinese export restrictions and the invasion of Ukraine are the more relevant factors. But yes, we've also seen high energy prices impacting it, particularly because it's meant that input costs have increased, in that ammonia has become a bigger cost for phosphate and driven up prices that way.
And to help Western Europe, is there any way a place like Finland can crank out more phosphate fertilizer?
So they recently had a conference in Europe to look at possibilities of increasing fertilizer production within Europe. The trouble that a lot of producers in Europe are having is that they can't source ammonia, and sourcing ammonia has become very difficult as they try to not buy it from Russia. We see this year there's going to be a big demand destruction in Europe, and that could possibly recover into next year. But at the moment, it's you have one suspended plant in Lithuania because they couldn't source ammonia, and a lot of other plants are running on part capacity just because they can't get a hold of ammonia for DAP and for NPKs.
I have a question over here. It says, what the fragile agricultural system should do with the phosphorus consumption challenges you mentioned?
I'm afraid this one's a little bit past my remit, in that it's quite difficult to it's a very difficult thing, isn't it? Because you want to ensure that people have access to food, and for that you need fertilizers. But when fertilizer prices are so prone to spiking, it can be difficult to balance those things. I guess the important thing would be for key countries that really need a high amount of fertilizer and that are very reliant on imports, particularly in Brazil and India. If I were to make a normative suggestion for their sustainability, is that to ensure that they have their own supply of fertilizers available to them, whether that's through importing phosphate rock or through developing their own phosphate resources.
Is China pursuing a similar curtailment in crop exports similar to phosphorus?
Not that I am aware of, but I do work mostly with fertilizer markets. If you want to get a hold of me later on, that's something I can look into for you. All right, thank you so much, everyone.